Okay, so today we're going to finish out talking about the autonomic nervous system, at least for now. And hopefully by the end of class, we'll break into thinking about one of the types of effector organs for this system are endocrine glands. Okay. So let's start with one question to jog our memories of where we left off. So when we were talking before, talking about the different types of neurotransmitters we see released from our two branches of the autonomic nervous system. And we were talking about the receptors that then receive these signals on our postganglionic neurons first, and then on our effector organs. We're thinking about the actual target overall of the autonomic nervous system. So one of our types were our adrenergic receptors. That's what we were doing at the very end of class. And so I want to touch base on those again to make sure that we got it. We know how to think about these receptors. Okay, got some people in here, so let's take another second or two. If you're still thinking, go ahead and pick one, and we'll go over it. Okay, yeah, so most of you got this correct. So the answer is a beta 2 receptor. I'm going to walk through how to think about this. So we have that chart in slides and in our textbook that we're consulting. Part of the reason I'm emphasizing this right now is last year, Dr. Schlater and I both noticed that lots of people missed questions on our receptor types. So they're important. They should be relatively straightforward, but they are an important thing to study. Okay. So the way we're thinking about receptors is we know already by this word epinephrine, right? And I'm stepping us back a second. So we know because we're thinking about epinephrine, this means we're thinking about adrenergic receptors because those are the ones that receive epinephrine and norepinephrine. Adrenergic. And we can already tell another piece of information here. So because we know this is epinephrine and an adrenergic receptor, we also know we are talking about the sympathetic nervous system because if we were talking about parasympathetics, we'd be talking about cholinergic receptors. We even know that we're thinking about a receptor on an effector organ because always in the middle point between our two neurons in the chain that we're thinking about, that's again acetylcholine. So we know that this is on a sympathetic effector organ. Okay. And we can confirm that because we can see that we're acting on blood vessels, and blood vessels are one of the places we see smooth muscle. So that's an effector organ overall for our autonomic nervous system. Okay. So to figure out the receptor type beyond that, we have the 5 types here of our adrenergic receptors. Okay? So one of the immediate things that we're going to be thinking about, we can think about what neurotransmitter our adrenergic receptors prefer. We can think a little bit about the signal transduction mechanism inside the cell. So how inside the cell this is ultimately having an effect. We can also kind of last thing look at the effect overall on the effector organ. Okay. So to tell alpha from beta, we're going to start by thinking about that signal transduction mechanism. Okay. So what is the signal transduction mechanism here? So we can see we have the second messenger, cyclic AMP, being activated. Okay. So when we have our cyclic AMP being activated, we know that this has to be a beta receptor. Okay. So going alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, beta 3. Right. For an alpha 1 receptor, you'd see the signal transduction mechanism be through IP3. For an alpha 2, you would see cyclic AMP, but we'd be inhibiting it. So we're turning off that signal. So, all right, cyclic AMP, if I'm going to cross it out, right? So we're in effect turning off a cyclic AMP signal with an alpha 2 receptor. So for all 3 of our beta receptors, this is where we see that activation of cyclic AMP. Okay. So that narrows us down. So another thing we can look at here are our affinities. Okay. So high affinity for epinephrine actually on its own could get us to the answer here. Okay. So the reason for that is both of those alpha receptors, right? Another way we can think about alpha receptors is both alpha receptors prefer norepinephrine. Okay. So both alpha receptors, like norepinephrine, could bind to epinephrine, but if there's enough norepinephrine circulating around, they won't want to. For our beta 1 through 3, we've got some variation. So both beta 1 and beta 3, in this respect, they're going to act kind of similar. So both of these are going to feel completely equivalently about norepinephrine and epinephrine. Right? So they totally do not care what you have. So by process of elimination, right, alpha receptors prefer norepinephrine. Beta 1 and beta 3 don't pair. Beta 2 is our odd one out. The beta 2 receptors far prefer epinephrine above anything else. So that's one way we could get to our answer of beta 2 receptor. Okay. And we actually have an additional characteristic that's specific to beta 2 receptors on this list. The beta 2 receptors are the ones that we see creating inhibitory effects in general on their effector organs. Okay. So this is kind of a thought process of how you should be thinking about any questions about receptors. You kind of got like a mental checklist. You're thinking, what neurotransmitter is it? And so what part of the nervous system are we associated with? Are we in the middle of 2 neurons? Are we at the end point? If we're at the end point, we know acetylcholine is going to be parasympathetic. Cholinergic receptors, our sympathetic nervous system effector organs are going to have these adrenergic receptors associated with epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then we can further break those down like this. So this is that table I was redrawing. All I really did was switch these 2 columns, but that's how we're thinking through this. So questions about these adrenergic receptors. This is probably the kind of thing to put on flashcards, right? Or just fill in a blank table. And I would focus on these affinities and transduction mechanisms. But if I'm asking you
I'll give you the full suite of information because might as well get you there any way you want to get there. But those are the two more important pieces of this. So when we think about the nervous system, like backing up, one of the reasons that we try to understand all this stuff is that we have a bunch of drugs, pharmaceuticals, that affect all the parts of nerves and affect all the parts of signaling and receiving. So this is just showing a selection of drugs that affect the autonomic nervous system specifically. So you can see drug names and what they do over here. And you can see in these mechanisms of action, some of these we can now understand, right? So our muscarinic agonist, so muscarinic was one of our two types of cholinergic receptors. And so this is kind of increasing the effect of those cholinergic receptors here. So we can see that again down here. All right, and then we've got a bunch of stuff affecting our sympathetic effector organs by affecting those adrenergic receptors. And you can see that we can target all the different types depending on what we want to do here. We can even affect our release of these neurotransmitters separately, right? So change how much of each neurotransmitter we have is also going to have an effect overall on some of the effector organs to treat specific conditions. So this is why you want to learn these. It's when you eventually go on and think about healthcare and how different drugs work, think about pharmacology. This comes back. Okay. So we know now about the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system. We know we have preganglionic and postganglionic neurons that go to effector organs. We know a bit about the signaling when we think about the neurotransmitters and the types of receptors. Now we're going to think about the connection point at the end of that postganglionic neuron where it touches the effector organ. This is going to be like a modification of what we talked about when we did the synapse in our last unit. So it's going to look a little bit different, but a lot of those same concepts are coming into play here. So what we're looking at here, we're looking at a neuron coming in. So this is our postganglionic neuron. So that second one in this kind of signal chain. We had our preganglionic, now our postganglionic. And here we have our effector organ, right? So this one, given it's a pink sheet, probably showing us like a sheet of muscle or something, but lots of options for what it could be. Okay. So where we see in our neurons in the brain or in our little stereotypical neuron we've been drawing, where we would see that axon terminal, now we see a slightly different structure in these autonomic postganglionic neurons. Okay, so instead of having just like one little endpoint that we're focused on, when we're looking here at our postganglionic neuron, we can see that they have these structures called varicosities. So these varicosities are these little swellings, so these little beads that you can see here. Okay, so these are varicosities. And we can see that they're kind of spread across the surface of our effector organ here, right? So we're not looking at a direct point-to-point connection. We're looking at something that's a little bit more diffuse here in this image. Okay. So when we look at this connection point, we're going to be still thinking about neurotransmitters. We're still going to be thinking about synaptic vesicles, but we're potentially going to be able to have a little more kind of like widespread kind of general effects rather than action potential directly from one cell into another cell. Okay. So we'd still have an action potential coming down, right? So our action potential, that wave of depolarization, and we're still going to be releasing neurotransmitter from our neuron, but this time we're located in any one of these varicosities, right? So it could be this one, could be that one. Realistically, it's all of them, right? Okay. So this kind of connection here, what we're looking at is the neuroeffector junction. Okay, so neuro for neuron, effector for effector organ. I'm just telling you what exactly we're connecting here in this image. So we're looking at the postganglionic neuron, our effector organ. We can see those neurotransmitters still in these swellings on the end points of the axon. So we're still going to release them when an action potential comes down, exactly like when we were thinking about the synapse. Right. So you can go through the steps. So when we talked about the synapse, the first thing that happened was we had that wave of depolarization come down the axon, get to the axon terminal and depolarize it. In this case, same thing, but now that action potential is coming down to these varicosities at the end. These varicosities are going to behave very similarly to the way that that axon terminal did. So when that action potential gets there, we're still going to have a calcium channel open. So this is a voltage gated calcium channel. Important that it's voltage gated, right? Because action potentials are voltage essentially, right? So this voltage potential change triggers this to open. Calcium has a strong electrochemical driving force to go into the cell. So our calcium is going into the cell here. Okay. And calcium coming into the cell is our signal to dock these vesicles, so these little baggies of neurotransmitter. So merge them into the membrane, we're docking them and releasing them through the process of exocytosis, exo outside of, cytosis, the cell. Site always means cell. Okay. So we got our neurotransmitter. Now here in this space between our effector organ and our varicosity, and we're still going to need a receptor on that effector organ, just like we needed a receptor on a postsynaptic neuron. So you can see here in this example on the left, we have a cholinergic receptor. So this is acetylcholine, right? And we see here. On the image on the right, we're looking at norepinephrine coming in to an adrenergic receptor here. Okay. So once we got this neurotransmitter bound in, we're going to have a reaction. When we're thinking about connecting up to effector organs, we tend to have more nuanced, complicated responses than we would if we were connecting two neurons together, right? Because you want your cell to like do something, but the something is kind of in question and depends on the cell. Versus if you're connecting neuron to neuron, you really just want to set off another action potential. So that's why we might notice that both the cholinergic receptor and the adrenergic receptor here are G protein coupled, right? So specifically on effector organs for the parasympathetic nervous system, you see that muscarinic type of cholinergic receptor, similar to our metabotropic receptors in the last unit. Adrenergic receptors are always G protein coupled. Our other type of cholinergic receptor one is why I'm emphasizing this. Okay, so we then have our reaction in the cell, and we gotta get rid of our neurotransmitter. So the neurotransmitter gets broken down, right? So here we have acetylcholine being broken down by an enzyme here, acetylcholinesterase on this effector organ. So it can diffuse out, we reuptake. So we have our reuptake molecule taking in some of that choline so we can reuse it and make more neurotransmitter. Here we don't see an enzyme in this particular image for norepinephrine, but we do see this direct reuptake of some of that norepinephrine. This is just a modification of what we saw before in synapses, same process, but now a little more specialized, a little bit of a difference as we see these different cell types. Okay. So these are some questions that hopefully you'll be able to answer by this point in our unit, right? So you want to make sure that you know what our different neurotransmitters are. You want to know that we've been talking about the peripheral nervous system. Specifically, we've been talking about the efferent part of the peripheral nervous system. And specifically, we've been talking about branches within the autonomic part of the peripheral nervous system. So we know we can name our different types of neurons. We now know that the neuroeffector junction is the connection to our effector organ. And as you're going through later at home, you want to be able to relate what you remember about synapses to what we're talking about with these neuroeffector junctions, and make sure that you got those linked up. And so if you feel a little foggy on those synapses, you might spend some time refreshing your understanding of that as well. So when we think about regulation of all this stuff, that's our final bit here. Right? We know that we have dual innervation of our organs, and we know that that means that both of the branches of the autonomic nervous system are coming in to the same effector organ. Right? So we got a parasympathetic signal, we got a sympathetic signal going to essentially the same place. So they're always both a little bit active, but we're going to shift back and forth which signal is stronger. Our parasympathetic part of the nervous system is in charge of rest and digest functions. So if you're chilling out eating chips, your parasympathetic nervous system should be active. Your sympathetic part of the nervous system is that fight or flight part of the nervous system. So any kind of like excitation, extra activity, we're going to vaguely associate in our minds with this sympathetic fight or flight kind of response. So anytime that you see an increase in the parasympathetic signaling, it's going to correspond to a decrease in the sympathetics. Anytime you see an increase in sympathetics, there's going to be a corresponding decrease in parasympathetics, but we're not really thinking of this as turning one totally off. So one of the places that we'll see this when we talk later on is when we talk about blood pressure. So we're thinking about right now how we have this kind of combination of effects. So one of the ways you manage to like not fall over and pass out when you stand up is through the activity of the autonomic nervous system. I think we watched a video on Parkinson's and a guy that was kind of like fainting all the time when he stood up. Parkinson's affects the nervous system. So one of the effects it can have is kind of damaging this reflex, this nervous reflex. Okay. So what happens when you stand up? Gravity acts on your whole body, right? So you might feel it because you feel heavy, but even your blood feels gravity. So when you stand up, your blood actually rushes to the floor, right? So rushes to your feet. So you start to pool blood in your feet when you stand up, right? And this is sometimes why you might see swelling in your feet if you've been on your feet all day. Okay. This is a problem for the sort of central part of your body because this means that initially you cause a drop in blood pressure in your systemic arteries. So your blood pressure drops and we need blood to like go to the brain, bring oxygen, glucose, help you think, right? So we don't like when there are big drops in blood pressure. Okay. So we're going to sense through a receptor. So part of that afferent part of the nervous system would be sensing that decrease in blood pressure. And that's something we want to maintain through homeostasis. That's important to regulate. So we're going to have a reflex response here. Okay. So that afferent nerve bringing signals back to your brain happens to be the case. The way your brain knows that you have a drop in blood pressure is your afferent pathway has been firing at like a specific pace the whole time. When your blood pressure drops, it kind of slows down, right? And your brain knows that that slowdown means your blood pressure went down. So you have centers in your medulla oblongata that create a response to this, right? We want to fix it. Okay. So we do something called your baroreceptor reflex. What we do is we increase the sympathetic activity So the sympathetic activity, that kind of excitation response, we're thinking clenching, we're thinking additional activity, is going to get active and act on blood vessels. And your parasympathetic activity, that rest and digest part, is going to turn itself way down, letting that sympathetic activity take over. So this is going to increase your heart rate. It's going to increase the force of heart contractions. It's going to affect your blood vessels. And the overall effect is your blood pressure comes back up. And we got a nice little negative feedback loop. So once your blood pressure comes back up, this all stops. We go back to normal. So this is one of the major roles of your autonomic nervous system in your body, requiring both of these kind of parts. Now, this is just a quick summary slide, remembering those effects for parasympathetics and sympathetics. So overall, we're associating parasympathetics with resting, relaxed states. This is also when you're going to hear like gurgling in your gut as you're digesting food. Going to be lowered heart rate, lowered blood pressure, just kind of calm. Okay. In sympathetic activity, this is a fight or flight response to some type of stressor. So we're preparing for some type of emergency, some type of stress. Maybe this is happening as you're exercising, getting those muscles working. So we're going to increase the heart rate, pump blood faster, get muscles more oxygen so you can have more energy in those muscles, increase blood pressure because we want that blood pressure to provide blood to our muscles potentially. When we link this up to our understanding of the endocrine system, we're going to know that this is also going to help us mobilize some energy stores. So we're thinking like we're going to be getting glucose from glycogen and helping break that down, that kind of thing, right? To get us more ATP in our muscles and other places. Also happens to have an effect on your pupils. It happens to like dilate them a little bit. And while you're running away from something or fighting, you don't want to pee yourself or poop your pants. So it also has a decrease in the gastrointestinal system and the urinary function, kind of all going together here. So at rest, we have a little bit of both of them kind of active, but the parasympathetics are in charge. We refer to this as tonic activity. Tonic activity is going to be, when we see it again in muscles, we're going to think of it as like a little kind of like baseline tension, a little bit of baseline activity always present. Okay. And here we can see some of the regulation centers for your autonomic nervous system. So you can see that this is really important and really kind of like basal, right? So this is brainstem stuff. This is not like thinking parts of your brain. This is involuntary, keep you going, keep you alive parts of your brain. Cool. So here are some of those effects, more detailed on different parts of the body. So we will be coming back to these parts of the nervous system and their effects when we talk about the heart in our final unit of this course. And we'll be talking about it in A&P2 when we think about blood vessels and lungs and the digestive tract. And we're about to talk about endocrine stuff. So we're about to talk a little bit about the pancreas. Probably not today, probably Wednesday, I would say. Okay, cool. So we're gonna break into the endocrine system next. Give me a second to pull that up. We're gonna be thinking about glands. When we're thinking about the endocrine system, right, we're thinking about glands. We already know that glands are one of the targets of our autonomic nervous system. So for some of this stuff, we're going to see some linkage to these autonomic functions we just talked about. I don't know how many of them you've seen in the body yet. I'm going to ask you in a second, but in general, when you see them in the future in the lab, they're going to look kind of fatty, kind of lumpy. Where they come from embryologically and through development, they're coming from epithelial tissue. So epithelial
Tissue is like any lining, either of the outside of your body or of like a lumen, so like a tube that goes all the way through you. Okay? So they're kind of specialized from that type of tissue. So endocrine organs, endocrine glands, what we're thinking about when we use the word endocrine, we're thinking about hormones, right? That's their point, is to produce hormones. That's what the endocrine system does. And when we think about hormones, when we call something a hormone, we're kind of thinking about like distant signaling. When we talk about hormones, we're talking less about a specific type of molecule, so much as we're talking about some type of signal that is released from a cell, gets into the bloodstream, and goes somewhere. In general, when we're thinking about hormones, we're thinking about kind of like widespread distant effects rather than like just affecting the neighboring cell. So when we think about these, think about these endocrine organs, we have some parts of the body that their first main job is endocrine function. And so those are going to be our primary endocrine organs. Okay? So when you think about that organ, you immediately think about hormones. We have other parts of the body that do have endocrine function, but they also have other, something more important jobs, right? So those are secondary endocrine organs. So we're going to have organs that have dual functions or maybe triple functions. So lots of different things they're doing. So here's a list of our primary endocrine organs and where you can see them. So we have our hypothalamus and our pituitary gland, pineal gland up in the head and the brain. As we move downwards, we have a thyroid gland and parathyroid gland in our neck. Moving a little bit further down, we'll see the thymus. So the thymus isn't that large in adults, but is particularly large in children. Then moving further down, on top of our kidneys, we've mentioned the adrenal glands, but here you can see them peeking through a little bit. They're behind, so they're a little shaded, but you can see that little hat on top of the kidney. That's an adrenal gland. Your pancreas is tucked under your stomach, essentially. Your pancreas is another primary endocrine organ. And your gonads are primary endocrine organs as well, so like testes and ovaries. Okay. So which of those have you seen in lab so far? Do you remember? Some of these should be familiar. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, cool. So you should definitely have seen these top two. I'm not sure if you could see that the one that I have a question about is maybe, I don't think it was on your list, but I don't know if someone might have pointed out a pineal gland to you when you were doing brain stuff. But you definitely saw the hypothalamus and the pituitary on that midsection of the brain. Right? So on that middle part of the brain where you see a cross section, we have the hypothalamus kind of pinching off in a little stalk and leading to a little tiny pituitary gland. And that happens to be part of what's sitting in the sella turcica in the center of your skull. You remember that from the skull lab. Okay. I'm telling you that because we're going to start in a second and think about that hypothalamus and pituitary gland. They're going to be one of our major topics for the endocrine system.
here's a quick list for you of secondary endocrine organs. We're not going to focus on them so much right now, but we will think about some of them when we get to these specific units. So your heart, kidneys, and GI tract actually all do release some hormones. So does your liver, even your skin and your fat release some hormones. So these all have the ability to signal to parts of your body that are far away by putting these chemicals into the bloodstream as messengers. Okay. So we're going to start by thinking about that hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Okay. So anybody who didn't remember where those were, I'm going to highlight those for you now. So they're in this box, right? So our hypothalamus is here. So this part, right, is your hypothalamus. So you can see that coming down, right, below the thalamus, right? So hypo means below. Okay. You can see this little stalk, that's our infundibulum, or the stalk of the pituitary, leading into this gland here. Okay. So you might not have noticed when you were looking at the pituitary gland in lab is that it's actually split in half, right? So it has two lobes, right? So it's got a front part, an anterior pituitary, and a posterior part, or posterior pituitary. And this is going to matter because they're going to work differently. So they're both going to be involved with our endocrine system. They're both going to be involved in signaling. These are primary endocrine organs, but we're going to have different connections with nerves and cells and blood and stuff in these two halves of the pituitary gland. Okay. So we are going to start with the back. So the posterior pituitary is actually going to be the simpler part, which is why we're starting. Okay. So in the back half, this posterior part of the pituitary, right? So we're looking at this back half, right? We're going to have what we describe as neurohormones being released. So these neurohormones are hormones that are released from neurons, essentially. Okay. So we're thinking of them as hormones because they're getting into the bloodstream, going through the blood, signaling to far away organ systems, having this kind of generalized effect, but they're coming from neurons themselves. Okay, so here we can see the association between neurons that start in the hypothalamus and these structures in the posterior pituitary. Okay, so here we can see we got a neuron in our hypothalamus. Here's its body and its dendrites. Here we can see that axon heading down, right? And we can see that axon linking up here, touching this artery. And in particular, we can see it touching our capillaries here in the posterior pituitary. So when this neuron releases stuff from those axon terminals, okay, so this is still a neuron coming from your brain. This is kind of separate from that autonomic stuff we've just been doing. We're kind of going back to like central nervous system stuff here. Yep. So we got this neuron going directly to these arteries and capillaries in the posterior pituitary. And when they secrete stuff, it gets into the blood directly. So that's why it's a neurohormone. So there are two types of hormones coming here from the posterior pituitary. We might also refer to them as peptide hormones. That's a different type of classification. So neurohormone tells us it's being released from a neuron. Peptide hormone tells us about the chemical structure. A peptide hormone is going to look kind of like a protein, right? Like polypeptide, where a bunch of amino acids together. So peptide hormones are derived from amino acids. And there are only two that come from the posterior pituitary, which is the other reason this is simple. That's simple, one, because we just have neurohormones directly from neurons starting in the hypothalamus, extending into the posterior pituitary. And we only have two hormones that we need to know about. So one of them is antidiuretic hormone, which we're going to abbreviate as ADH when we talk about it extensively in our unit on the kidneys next semester. It's also sometimes called vasopressin, usually not when you're talking about the kidneys. Its main target is, though, the kidney, because its job
is to help you regulate blood pressure by helping you regulate basically how much water you pee out in your urine. So it's going to help you reabsorb water into your body, maintaining blood volume, maintaining blood pressure. So we'll come back to that one later on when we talk about AMP2. The other hormone, which will also come back in AMP2, is oxytocin. So oxytocin is sometimes described as a hormone in charge of love, lust, and labor. It does lots of stuff. People usually think about it as like a bonding hormone, but it actually has a lot more jobs than that in your body. So especially though in like pregnancy and childbearing and raising children, it has a lot of effects. So it's going to be related to breastfeeding. It's going to be related to actually giving birth. So muscle contractions during labor are going to be associated with oxytocin. But it has also a role to play in the sexual response in everybody, basically. So while we think about it with these sort of childbearing characteristics, it has effects on your brain for sure, whoever you are in this room. Okay. When we think about the anterior pituitary, picture gets more complex. We're going to have a lot more hormones coming from the anterior pituitary, and we're going to have a more complex pathway for their release. Okay. So in order to understand that, we're first going to define this term, these tropic hormones. When we say something is a tropic hormone, what we mean is that we have one hormone gets into the bloodstream, swimming around. It's going to come in to another cell that is part of the endocrine system, so like a different gland or something, that then goes on to release its own hormones. So you want to think about tropic hormones as being like dominoes that you're toppling over in a line. That's what our tropic hormones do. Now, their effect could be either to stimulate the release of more hormones or to stop those cells further on down the line from releasing hormones. So it can be an inhibitory effect as well. It's just that they have an effect further down the line. When we look at the structure of the anterior pituitary, which is going to be releasing first from the hypothalamus a bunch of tropic hormones, we're going to see that we have a more complex vasculature kind of system. Specifically, you can see here we have two capillary beds. So capillaries are where you have tiny little blood vessels with kind of thin walls and stuff can cross those thin walls. So capillaries are where you're going to see a bunch of exchange between the blood and tissue surrounding them, or any cells surrounding them. So what we have here, when we have two capillary beds, is we've got two sites where we can have exchange with surrounding cells. Okay. So we're going to have exchange first between cells in the hypothalamus that are going to secrete stuff into this first capillary bed. Then we're going to have a vein called the portal vein. So this portal vein is like a portal to the second capillary bed, right? So the second capillary bed is located in the anterior pituitary itself, in this anterior lobe, right? And here we can see we have endocrine cells, right? So these kind of glandy cells in the anterior pituitary that we can see are communicating with the blood in this second capillary bed, both taking in signals and putting out their own signals. Okay. So, question for you. I am going to describe 3 hormones or chemicals that affect your body, and you're going to tell me which of these counts as a tropic hormone.
Okay, let's take a look. Okay, so is this first answer choice? Okay, so how can we tell? So tropic hormone is one that affects the release of another hormone. So in this example, and only this example, we have a hormone, gonadotropin, that is affecting another hormone, the luteinizing hormone. In each of these other examples, we're doing something in the body, but we have norepinephrine affecting blood pressure. We have estrogen affecting sexual characteristics. We don't see another hormone listed. Right? So to be a tropic hormone, you're always going to be looking for two hormones that directly affect each other. Okay. So we will be talking about this next time, but before we go, I just want to point out to you a chart. So you have a version of a chart like this in your book, and I have one in here for you for the slides. These are how many hormones that we're thinking about coming from the anterior pituitary. So it's worth taking a little bit of a look through some of this stuff and trying to wrap your brain around it before we talk about it on Wednesday, because it's going to be a lot of words. That's just a heads up, and we'll stop there for today.